Welcome to the first integration event in the Innovate LLC. My name is Dr. DeConnick. I teach in theology and religious studies here at the University of San Diego. And I am super enthusiastic to be affiliated also with the Innovate LLC, which I'm pretty sure everyone in this room can agree is just objectively the best LLC. So we're excited to be hosting this first kickoff kind of event in the series with you tonight. And just before we get started, I wanted to invite Dr. Lopez Perez, who's one of our 4 presenters today, just to share the USD land acknowledgement. As we're talking about themes of home and homelessness in our conversation tonight, it feels appropriate to acknowledge the land acknowledgement as well. So I'll turn that to you.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. So I want to acknowledge that the land on which USD resides is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I want to pay respects to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral land.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good. All right. So I'm going to start things off for our event tonight and just kind of get us set up and kind of manage some expectations about what today is going to look like. And then I'm going to invite the other presenters in just a couple minutes to introduce themselves and also just to give the kind of 1 to 2 sentence introduction to what is the discipline or the academic field that you're affiliated with and how would you kind of define it just to frame our event tonight. But before we start with that, I just wanted to share a couple of kind of Zoom etiquette and navigation tips to make sure everybody's on the same page for today. We have a pretty large audience for today. You know, by the time we really get started, I think we'll have close to about 100 people. So since there's such a large group, we're going to ask you to please keep your audio, your microphone muted to minimize the background noise or any distractions during the event today. Also, just in order to prevent the video from lagging in Zoom, which I'm sure a lot of you have been seeing in your classes as internet is struggling with the bandwidth in different places. When we do the initial presentations, which we're going to try and keep pretty short at the start of the event, it would be helpful if you could turn your camera off now, just through that part of things. And then when we start with the Q&A, it's perfectly great if you want to turn your camera on for that. But just to make sure that we don't have lagging Zoom, please do turn your camera off now if you're able to. And obviously keep watching and listening. And then we also would just suggest that you put your Zoom into what's called speaker view. If you don't have it in that already, it'll just focus on whoever happens to be speaking at the present moment. And it's just going to make for a better viewing experience and a less distracting experience for you too. But you can decide if you want to do that or not. Okay. So we're going to start off just by kind of framing, you know, the issues. We're going to talk a little bit broadly about, you know, homelessness and the housing crisis here in San Diego and in our country in just a few minutes. And then, you know, in just a second, I'm going to, like I said, ask each faculty member to briefly introduce themselves. Just so you know, we are going to have extended period of time for questions and answers tonight. And the way that we've decided to manage things is we're going to drop into the chat area in Zoom. So you can open up the chat window. We're going to put the link to a Google Doc there. Okay. And in this Google Doc, you can type in any questions that you want to ask the speakers while we're talking. Maybe we say something that you're really curious about, or you want to know how one professor might respond to another about something that they say or something like that. But the Google Doc is how we're going to moderate the questions during the Q&A period. So we can drop that link in just a second here. And the way that it works is you type in whatever question you want. If someone has asked a question that you really love, that you would love to, you know, have us talk about tonight, you put an asterisk next to it, right? And that tells us that multiple people are interested in that question, and it kind of upvotes the question in a way. Okay, so let me just put that in the chat right now. So if you haven't used Zoom too much, right, you have this bar on the bottom of your screen. There should be a icon there that says chat. And I'll drop it a few times just in case anybody misses it. But this is the document that we're going to use, the Google Doc, to moderate the questions. Okay, so we'll keep that up and keep an eye on it during our chat today. Okay. I think that's everything for logistics, just to kind of kick us off. Is there anything else that any of our other presenters want to add before we start with our formal introductions, or does that cover it?
Good.
Good. Okay, good. So we have, we're really lucky to have, you know, 4 wonderful professors gathered tonight for the first integration event. As we're talking about integration, and you're hearing more about this in your classes here at USD, this is the first event in the series where we're asking students to start practicing integration, right? So what we're saying really is we're inviting you to start considering the value of what it means to approach problems or situations in today's world from an interdisciplinary perspective. So tonight you're going to hear from 4 of us who all represent different academic disciplines who are going to speak to how their area and their discipline might approach some of the questions or the topics surrounding homelessness or housing. So that's our theme for tonight. Okay. So I will be the first presenter, but I've been talking a lot. So I think I'm going to invite Dr. Lopez Perez to introduce himself first and introduce architecture as his field.
Thank you, Kate. That's right. My name is Dr. Lopez Perez, and I'm faculty in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History at the basement of Camino. So you're all welcome to come and visit. For us, we are actually thrilled that the question of homelessness and housing is now in the public consciousness. We have, of course, as the discipline of the built environment, committed ourselves. And in fact, we have an entire course every year for our 3rd years committed to this question. And it's extraordinary that we are in 2020 and we haven't solved it, right? I mean, it's an extraordinarily complex question that I'm very much looking forward throughout this year to explore and discuss with other colleagues. So do I popcorn Matt? Is that how we, yeah, okay. Matt, you were just to my right, that's why.
Well, there we go then. All right, hi everybody, I'm Matt Zwolinski. I am a professor of philosophy here at USD, and I'm also the director of the interdisciplinary minor in philosophy, politics, and economics. And it's in that capacity that I'll be speaking with you tonight. In philosophy, politics, and economics, or PPE as we call it, we try to bring together the analytical tools of moral philosophy and economics to think about issues of politics, political science, public policy, and housing is one of these fantastic issues for PPE in that it both involves moral questions about justice and fairness and equity, but also a lot of economic concepts about scarcity and supply and demand. And so I'll be touching on just some of those ideas tonight in my short presentation. And I will turn things over. I got 2 choices here. I guess I'm going to call Gordon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Gordon Hoople in the School of Engineering. And so I'm really excited to be here tonight to speak with you about engineering's role in addressing this urgent challenge of homelessness. So engineering is this process of using scientific, mathematical, and technical understanding of the world to solve problems that benefit humanity. And I really want to emphasize that benefit humanity, right? Everything that engineers do is kind of guided by this idea of how can we make the world a better place? I'll talk a little bit later about how we don't always succeed at that. But homelessness is certainly an area where engineers have a lot to offer. And I think it's a spot where we've really not seen the innovation that's needed. So for any of those future engineers out there, I think this is a space where there's really room to have some great innovation to connect to our LLC theme.
And I'm last but not least, so I'm going to jump in here too. So I'm Kate DeConnick. I mentioned this before, Dr. DeConnick. I'm in theology and religious studies. And religious studies is a really cool field because it in and of itself is really interdisciplinary. There's no one methodology or one way of studying things that every person in my field uses. So I personally am trained in the history and the anthropology of religion. So what that means is I look at how religious practitioners' beliefs and their practices, how these things come to life in complicated ways historically and also in today's world. And my subspecialty is looking at situations of kind of mass tragedy. So I consider how religious individuals and communities draw on rituals and they draw on their core beliefs and other strategies and ways of thinking that are available to them through their tradition to address all sorts of complicated situations of suffering in today's world. So I've done research about the aftermath of 9/11 and the Sandy Hook shooting. And a lot of my work now is centered around homelessness as a different, but equally important type of suffering that we see in our world today. So this is like our little snapshot telling you, all right, these are the disciplines, right? And now you have a little bit of a sense of what to expect. Okay, so what's our plan from here? We've decided for our session today to really try and keep our initial comments as short as possible. Fingers crossed, right? As you know, your professors love to talk sometimes, right? We'll see. But we really want to invite conversation, right? So each of us is going to offer just a few minutes or a few, snapshots of reflections from our different fields. And then that's when, after that is done, maybe about 5 to 7-ish minutes per person, then we're going to open it up for conversation with the whole group, right? So that's where we'll draw questions from the Google Doc, and we'll really want to make it interactive at that point. Okay, so please use the Google Drop. We can keep sharing the link with you in the chat. If you're feeling like you can't find it, just message one of the co-hosts tonight and we'll make sure you have the link to that doc. Okay. All right, so just to kind of, get things started, we have a presentation with some slides that we're going to share. We promise we're not going to talk at you for another 48 minutes because I'm just going to guess that you've all been having a lot of people talking at you this week. Lectures and other things in your classes, right? Mine included. So I'm just going to do a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to share my presentation, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Lopez Perez, who's going to talk more, from his disciplinary perspective, and we'll go right down the line. Okay. So just to start, again, here's the name of our presenters for this evening, if you kind of missed anybody's names. But really where we wanted to start our actual conversation is framing the two issues that we're going to be talking about at least a little bit before we dive into our disciplinary perspectives, right? So just to kind of start, thinking a little bit about the situation of homelessness as, a dynamic that we see in San Diego, but other parts of the country and the world as well. San Diego is a city in the US that has the 5th largest population of persons who are experiencing homelessness out of any city in the nation, right? So each night, this is accurate as of, January 2020 was the last time that we did a point in time count where we tried to get as accurate as possible a sense of how many people in our city are sleeping on the streets or in a shelter. And the count this year revealed that there were actually more than 7,500 people facing those circumstances, at least on that one night, right? So this is a real situation that our city takes seriously, and that the University of San Diego is committed to thinking about as well. What does it mean to have this dynamic of homelessness in our city? Okay, also kind of a related topic, right? These two really go hand in hand, is the lack of affordable housing. So one of the main factors that actually can lead to homelessness is a lack of affordable housing. And here in San Diego, for any of you who are remotely familiar with, property values and things like that in our city here, it's a very expensive city to be living in. So, oftentimes it's just one crisis or one medical emergency or something like that that suddenly leads an individual or a whole family to kind of be housing insecure or actually lose their home. Okay. And then just a little reminder about, our theme of Innovate for our LLC. The way that we've defined this theme for our purposes is that innovation is the creativity is the power to see things differently. So it's helpful to keep that phrase right in the back of your mind as you're taking down some notes about our event and how we're framing innovation through the lens of our work as well. So what you're going to see tonight are some of the ways in which different academic disciplines are helping us to see these issues of housing and homelessness in innovative and kind of productive ways as well. Okay. And then we're not going to read these, but we just wanted to really start our event off tonight with a human-centered approach. It's really easy when we start talking about housing or homelessness and these big social crises to lose sight of the fact that it's individual people in our community and in our worlds who are touched by these realities, right? So the quotes that we have up on the screen here, these are just a few samples of things that came out of some research interviews that were done with people over the summer here in San Diego, people who in the past or presently are experiencing homelessness. So you see people talking about the conditions under which they find themselves evicted in different ways. You see how medical emergencies factor into people's lives. And you also see this real recognition among the community of folks who are unsheltered or who are housing insecure that this could really happen to anyone, which is not something that we always, it's not always how we think about homelessness in our culture today. So just a little kind of food for thought in terms of thinking about these different perspectives. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna kind of launch into my piece next and just kind of speak for a few minutes about kind of religious responses to homelessness and the way that I think about this topic and the way that I talk to people in our community about it who are parts of religious communities themselves. Okay, so I spent a good part of my summer actually talking to different religious leaders across the city of San Diego about the ways that they think about homelessness from their own perspective, from their own faith traditions. And what I wanted to share with you tonight is just a really small snapshot of this bigger picture and these bigger conversations that I've been having. So just to kind of frame it a little bit here, it's important to know that of all of the emergency beds that are provided in US cities for folks who are experiencing homelessness, a tremendously high number of them are actually provided by faith-based organizations. So 58% of all emergency beds that are provided on any given night in the US are provided by communities of faith or faith-based organizations. In San Diego specifically, 1 out of every 3. So, a little bit less than the national average, but still a significant portion are provided by these faith-based organizations. So this is all to say religious communities and the ways that they think about the issue of homelessness, it really matters, right? They're having an impact in this area. So their framings and their beliefs and how they're, operating in their traditions is really affecting the reality for so many thousands of people. So I'm going to share, like I said, 2 snapshots from my research. The first is going to be a kind of Catholic perspective and thinking about, from a Catholic point of view, how do we understand this idea of homelessness, and how do people look at others in our society who are experiencing, the realities of being unsheltered? So the first quote on the screen here comes from a Catholic deacon who's also the head of this organization in San Diego called Father Joe's Villages. Who really emphasizes in his talk with me this idea of what he calls Christ's preferential option for the poor. This comes from a broader set of Catholic teachings known as Catholic social teaching. And what he's saying here is that, from the Catholic perspective, it's not only your kind of duty, but it's your privilege in a way to make a difference in the lives of other people. You see this also reflected in the second quote, which is from a book about Catholic social teaching. It's emphasizing the idea that from a Catholic point of view, the way that Catholics, at least in theory, are looking at folks who they're seeing on the streets is that God is present in every single human being, right? All life is sacred. And the idea that the poverty of Jesus, all of these stories that we see in the Gospels are pushing us in the direction of acknowledging the inherent dignity and the inherent worth of all human beings, okay? So this is the kind of, broad, just a snapshot into the Catholic perspective on how you might think about homelessness. And then how does this translate into action, right? Which is always the question that I have too. In the context of Father Joe's Villages, this is just a snapshot of the type of work that they're doing, this Catholic-based organization, right? They're providing housing to thousands of people each night. They're providing other kind of life-sustaining and life-supporting services like dental care, medical care, child care, and also things like employment classes and job searching tools and all sorts of other programs too, right? But you can see that it's this core focus on the human dignity piece that allows them to kind of go and expand and create all of these programs that are serving so many San Diegans today. Okay, and then just one other quick example that I wanted to share. I do a lot of work with the Islamic Center of San Diego, which is a really strong and wonderful presence here in our community. And this was taken from an interview that I did with one of the religious leaders, one of the imams there. And in this case, he's talking about how so much of his inspiration for the work that he does with unsheltered people comes from what he calls the prophetic example of Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? That's what the PBUH means. And so he talks really in this interview about if you were to go back and you were to look at some of the stories in the Quran about, what did Muhammad teach, right? And then what are some of the stories also about Muhammad's life itself? You see that the way that Muhammad models for his community is that even in the mosque, you have a space that's dedicated for people who have nowhere else to go, right? There's the idea that you still welcome them in, you don't make them sleep on the streets. They actually, a lot of the early followers who are part of this community go on to become great Islamic scholars. So they're not only welcomed, but they're embraced. And he also reiterates this core idea of serving people with dignity and respect. So, without reading the full quote to you here, you're getting a sense of similarly inspired by the core teachings of his tradition, right? Yeah, and then this is just a snapshot of some of the work that's now being done by the Islamic Center here in San Diego. So every year during Ramadan, you know, the holy month of fasting, you see this hygiene kit drive where they're putting together packages for people in the community. They're also politically active, which intersects in, you know, interesting ways with some of our other presenters for tonight, thinking about the lobbying work that they're doing to try and support people, support affordable housing projects in Claremont and other places, and all sorts of other ways that they're kind of engaging too, right? So this is, you know, a little piece of some of the questions and some of the conversations that I'm interested in having with people here in San Diego. And this is just the last thing I wanted to kind of leave you with, or kind of maybe a little takeaway to hold in your mind, you know, in the midst of all of these different pieces of information. The way that I'm seeing this from my perspective is that religious communities are harnessing the power to, quote, see things differently by drawing on their religious texts and their teachings, right? So we live in a society where there's so much stigmatization and stereotyping of unsheltered persons. That's the prevalent kind of mode that we see in so many communities. But in these cases, you know, these religious groups are acknowledging the inherent dignity and the inherent worth of all people, and also our collective responsibility to care for one another that's driven by their kind of ability to see things differently. So I probably went over time, I apologize, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lopez Perez, and I'm happy to navigate your slides. You just let me know when you want me to move ahead.
Thank you, Kate. No, that was perfect, perfectly on time. So welcome everybody. So whereas Kate was speaking about the problem of homelessness, I thought from our perspective, from the perspective of architecture and design in the larger sense, that I would speak about the problem of housing, right? In a sense, it is hard to understand one without the other, and they're both tied. You can advance. So from the perspective of architecture and the allied fields, we have to think of the architect as, you know, a technical expert with the question of housing. Of course, we have to provide housing. It has to match, you know, the different debt levels and densities that the city requires. But I want to encourage you, and our discipline is constantly zooming out, right? Understanding the question of housing as a social, cultural, and even political question. The question of housing is one of the oldest questions in the discipline of architecture, in the sense that it represents a manifesto of the relationship between the individual and the collective. So I'm constantly going to encourage you to zoom out and understand the way that we house people reflects some of those cultural, social, and even political structures and economic structures that that structure the relationship between the individual and the society. Of course, this is an incredibly difficult question, and we're always caught in these dichotomies of density. So you can move the slide. In contemporary systems of efficiency, as you have seen, universally, we're caught between two different kinds of densities. We're caught between horizontal cities that grow endlessness on your right, and this could be higher end, middle end, low end, subsidized housing, affordable housing, and the vertical city. Density going vertically, and this is universal models. The more efficient our building models are and our economic models, the more regularity and the more strength these two bipolar typologies gain strength, and the more difficult urban life. I mean, imagine on both instances in this slide, the relationship between the individual and culture and the culture around neighborhood and even larger systems. So this is really the crux of our problem, the space in between both of these. Oh, you're going to, this question isn't new. So at the beginning of the 20th century, innovators and the avant-garde was also caught in the relationship between high density and low density and the landscape. Go for it. in the work of Le Corbusier, a pioneer, a Swiss pioneer working in France and then globally. He also struggled between the relationship between the Gothic city, the really dense city that needs upgrade, that needs hygiene, that needs plumbing, and the radiant city, what he called, starting from scratch, and the placement of low density or really high density towers, and that space was still unresolved. As we move into the 1950s and 60s, people really gravitated towards building community, so that the role of the person rather than the type was the key by which we would understand a more harmonious relationship between the individual and its neighborhood, the collective, culture, and political and social and economic systems. So in Siam, an arm of the United Nations in charge of the built environment, scrolls were drafted that explored the relationship between the individuals rather than buildings. These still led, although there was a kind of a heightened awareness, still led to building typologies that fluctuated between low rise and high rise. So in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in the 1970s, all hell breaks loose, and there's an explosion of the type, right? We are gonna do away with the idea that we either live in towers or we live in low-rise horizontal cities, and we have extraordinary utopian projects like Una Friedman's Spatial Village, which mixes everything. Go for it. And has spaces like this, right? Production is below, work is below, traffic is below, in the middle is public life, up above is private life, and everything is mixed and matched as a way to challenge the idea that types are subjected, are forcing patterns of inhabitation. Go for it. These led to extraordinary projects that were actually built, like Habitat 67. But coming back to today, so today we continue to struggle on time-based projects like, for instance, Aravena here, who in Chile and all over Latin America explores the idea of time and time growth. Very rigid system that has the capacity to grow. And other systems like La Caton Vassal in France, who in northern Africa, who peel existing buildings as a way to open them up. So we are now trying to reconcile this dichotomy in multiple ways. Go for it. So to return back to San Diego, it's such a joy to show you just a little snapshot of the work that two of our students did. These are architecture students who worked over the summer on a McNair and Shore grant on the housing crisis last summer. We spoke with the city directly, and they often recommend things that we can take on. So we know, and it's Vicenta Martinez Govea, who I think she's here, and Jeanette, they're joining us. So San Diego housing crisis is extraordinary. There's a deficit of units. Go ahead. There is definitely a mismatch between rental prices and incomes, a negative mismatch in which people can't even afford some of the rental prices according to income. Go for it. So Vicenta and Jeanette, on the advice of the city, started to look at ADUs. These are accessory dwelling units that are attached to different houses. We can see them there on the lower right. And the city had just done away with a lot of different zoning requirements for people to add on to their existing property, have done away with the residential one, so that properties that can only house one. So this basically change in the law and in economic systems encourages people to build units in their literally in their backyards, above their garage, below. And this is what Jeanette and Vicenta were looking at. Go for it. So they started by looking at San Diego, the entire city, and identifying three very, very, very different places, three different neighborhoods and then trying to find solutions that are systematic, that are systemic in the way that we can deploy them. Go for it. They looked at Linda Vista, of course, because of our campus and because it is our neighborhood, and it is one of the most diverse and most challenging communities in San Diego. So they looked at the zoning, they looked at all kinds of things that constituted the plan. Go for it. And identified streets where, if you conceive of 10 neighbors at once beginning to densify, we're imagining the vertical typology now distributed horizontally onto additions. Go for it. So they compare the prices of Linda Vista, the price per square foot, the rental price, the kind of ordinances and the census information with Barrio Logan. And again, identified streets in Barrio Logan. And these are very different streets. And what happens in different neighborhoods is that there is a kind of a type that emerges that's characteristic of the neighborhood. And what was brilliant about Vicenta and Jeanette is that they wanted to find universal solutions across very different neighborhoods. Go. And the last one was La Jolla, so an upscale as a way to compare the kind of inequities of the previous two and begin to systematize the solutions. And here, once again, looking at an entire different grid and the possibility to densify a lot more. So just to end, the project ended in a number of strategies, some with pitched roofs, some that would standardize a building above garages, building above standard setback rules and standard program. One more slide, I think. That would be able to be deployed across all these different neighborhoods and be able to find equity and systems of efficiency that could be deployed in all three. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kate, for the slides.
Yeah, you're most welcome. We're just going to pause for a second, and we're going to once again kind of drop in the chat area the link to the Google Doc, and we're going to let Dr. Zwolinski is going to, I think, launch the slides for his part of the presentation next. But we know we had a couple folks trickling a little bit late, so we just want to remind everyone that we're using the Google Doc as the way that we'll moderate the questions. And yeah, after our next two presenters, we're going to get right into that. So I'm going to drop that in the chat in just a second. So Dr. Z, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so I'm, as I said, coming from a discipline that attempts to use the tools of philosophy and economics to analyze questions about politics and public policy. And what I want to do with you tonight, because this is a really complicated issue, there are a lot of different factors that explain the issue of homelessness, that explain the issue of a lack of affordable housing in San Diego and elsewhere. And so I'm not going to pretend to try to explain everything to you in the 5 minutes I've got. I'm just going to take one idea that I think plays an important role in explaining the problem, and that I think is simply just a really important concept for understanding a lot of different issues in public policy. So I've provocatively titled my talk, Democracy versus Affordable Housing. So we have a problem with affordable housing in San Diego, as Daniel helpfully set me up by illustrating. Why do we have that problem? Well, you'd think that in a democracy, which we supposedly have, the majority should rule, right? So if you've got a minority group, a small number of people who want something, and a much larger group of people who want something else, the much larger group ought to get their way. And sometimes indeed it works out that way, but often, and in particular kinds of situations, I want to say, it doesn't work out that way. So here's a case in point, and I won't even tell you how long it took me to get like 1,000 little person figures in my PowerPoint slide. Like there must be some much more efficient way of doing it, but I like took one image and then I copied it, and then I copied it again, and then I copied the. So this took a long time to do. I'm a philosopher, and the PowerPoint is not my forte. But so you got 5 people here versus 995 people. So 1,000 people total. And the 5 people want one thing, the 995 want something else, right? Let's say what the 5 people want is they want money. So they go to the government and they say, give us $500. And for them, that's great. Right? They get $500 if the government gives them what they want. But of course, somebody has to pay for the $500 cost, and that cost is going to fall on the tax base as a whole, which includes those 5 people. So I've added them back into that picture on the right. So the taxpayers as a whole are going to pay the cost of $500, and the 5 individuals are going to get the benefit of that $500. And it looks like there shouldn't be any way why this kind of thing should go through in a democratic system, right? There's 995 people, or 1,000 people really, who are paying a cost, 995 of whom are receiving no benefit, and 5 people who are getting some benefit out of it. So why would a democratic system ever pass something like this, what you might call a subsidy? The problem comes in when you shift from looking from net costs to per capita costs and benefits, right? So if you take that $500 and you divide it among the 5 people who are receiving that benefit, that's a benefit of $100 each. On the other hand, if you take the $500 cost that's incurred in generating that benefit and you divide that by the 1,000 taxpayers that are footing the bill, that's only a per capita cost of 50 cents. $100 each is significant, right? If I told you that you could get $100 from the government, you might care about that, right? You might even be inclined to call your congressperson, right? Or write a letter or send an email or something saying like, this is a really good idea, you should get behind it, and if you don't, I'm going to vote against you in the next election. If, on the other hand, you're paying a cost of 50 cents, who can be bothered to call their congressperson or threaten them that you're going to vote against them or write a nasty letter if all it's going to save you is 50 cents at the end of the day? So the problem here is that the people who are reaping the benefit of this policy have a very strong financial incentive to fight for its realization. And the people who are opposed to the subsidy have only a very weak incentive to do anything to oppose it. And so because the incentives are misaligned in that way, you're going to get much stronger pressure on the side of the numerically smaller group than you do on the numerically much larger group. And generally speaking, the smaller kind of group is going to win in this kind of case. And you see this all over the place in public policy. This is what explains a lot of, I would say, subsidy policies that we have in the United States, like agricultural subsidies that benefit a small number of farmers at the expense of higher prices for agricultural goods on the part of a much larger set of consumers. It also explains, I think, a lot of what's going on in housing policy. So the concept here that I want to introduce to you is the concept of rent seeking. This is a term that comes from the intersection of political science and economics. And it's defined in various ways by various people, but I think the simplest definition of rent seeking is using government policy to advance your private interest at the expense of the public good. So you've got this entity here, the government, that has the power of taking money from some people and giving it to others, or taking power from some people and giving it to others. And rent seeking involves trying to use that power for your own benefit and shifting the cost onto some third party. The reason rent seeking works, the reason we can get away with it, is that oftentimes in these scenarios, the benefits of rent seeking are tightly concentrated among a small group of individuals who therefore have a large per capita benefit and a high incentive to fight to obtain and maintain that benefit, whereas the costs of that policy are dispersed amongst a much larger group of people who thereby lack that same kind of incentive to do anything about it. And as I said, I think this explains a lot in public policy, but it especially explains a lot in terms of housing policy. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this phenomenon of NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. The idea is you've got some project that you want to build. Maybe it's high density housing, apartment complexes, maybe it's specifically affordable housing projects for people with low incomes. And everybody in the abstract thinks, sure, that's a great idea. We ought to have more housing. It's just, I don't want it in my backyard. And why don't they want it in their backyard? Well, they don't want it in their backyard because they worry, perhaps not unreasonably, but they do worry that it's going to drive down their housing values. They have invested in a home, which they view as not merely a place that they can live, but as a source of future wealth for them. They want the housing values to go up so they can make money off their house. And they worry that if somebody builds a big apartment complex next door, their housing values are going to go down. So what do? They lobby the government. In most cases, it's the local government, the city government, or the local planning commission to enact or maintain certain zoning rules that simply make it illegal to build high density housing in their neighborhood. So everybody's in favor of high density housing, but nobody wants it in their backyard, and they don't want it in their backyard because they worry it's going to affect their financial bottom line. So they use the power of the government to essentially prop up their housing values by blocking the creation of high density housing. Who pays the cost for that? Well, the cost is paid basically by everybody else who now has to pay a higher price for housing because the supply of housing has been in effect artificially limited by these zoning laws. And so it's a classic case of concentrated benefits and dispersed cost. The problem is it gets repeated over and over again in community after community. So even if you get the benefit from zoning laws in your own community, you're also paying the cost of everybody else's zoning laws in their community. And so you can make a pretty strong case that we're actually all worse off on aggregate from these kinds of policies than we would be if we didn't have them. So that's my one concept. Happy to talk with you more about it in the Q&A, but that's my one simple idea about housing policy that I wanted to get across for tonight. So I will stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Gordon.
I think you're muted.
I'm sharing my screen. Give me just 1 second.
Perfect.
All right, hopefully everyone can see that. So I wanted to pick up from where I kind of left off in the intro. I'm actually going to stick to 5 minutes, so don't worry, we'll be done soon. I just want to remind for those that maybe missed my introduction, kind of what engineering is, because I think there's often some misconceptions. Right? So engineering is this process of using our scientific and mathematical and technical understanding to address these challenges that face humanity. And homelessness is really one of these big challenges. I like this little word cloud here to kind of summarize a lot of the terms that we see in engineering. But you see it's a lot of problem solving and teamwork. And there's also this important element of ethics and thinking about what does it mean to do to have a positive impact on society. That's a really tricky question. And so when we think about, well, what are some of the great accomplishments of engineers? You ask somebody that question, there's a lot of great stuff, right? We have awesome telecommunications, right? We're all able to communicate via Zoom during COVID. That's totally amazing. If it was 50 years ago, where would we be, right? Transportation, right? Health technologies, right? The ability to extend lifespans. Electricity is a really profound and innovative tool that has just changed lives. But on the flip side, engineers have not always thought through the implications of their decisions, right? So we have climate change, which is kind of a direct result of the way we create electricity, right? We have conflicts over minerals that we use in our smartphones. Nuclear weapons are a particularly thorny topic that are a direct result of engineering. And of course, we have technologies like cars, which everybody loves, but kill 30,000 Americans every year. And so when we turn to this topic of homelessness and we think about the challenges facing unsheltered folks in our communities, where do engineers fit in? And there's kind of two things I just wanted to bring up to think about it at kind of two different scales. So one, chapter 7 in Golden Gates, I think does a really nice job of this. So this is the USD Just Reads book. I really encourage you all to read it. It's a really, really great read. And chapter 7 talks about how do we design housing? And it specifically talks about the fact that, and Dr. Lopez Perez got into this a little bit, that we need more modular housing if we're going to make it affordable. By and large, the way in which we build houses today looks very, very similar to the way we built houses 50 or 100 years ago. It's a carpenter with a saw and a hammer, and they're out there framing the house. And so kind of finding innovative ways to create housing that are much more affordable is one part of the equation to addressing homelessness. It's not the only thing, but it's one where engineers have a profound ability to make an impact. The other kind of area that engineers can interact and do at USD is in the example of kind of taking a user-centered approach to design. So we have a class that all engineers take called user-centered design. And the class project for the last 2 years has been focusing on working with Think Dignity, which is a local nonprofit that works with the unsheltered community here in San Diego. And what they do is they have all these mobile showers, amongst other things that they do. And so the students there, what they did is they worked with the local community leaders to think about how they could improve these showers to create solar water heaters. So that instead of using, having to figure out how to do a cold shower or using some kind of fossil fuel-based approach to heat water, instead we could use it, put a solar shower into one of these types of devices. So you could have hot water, but at a lower cost. And so one of the things there that I want to especially leave the engineers with in the audience is thinking about this idea of, you know, as someone trying to solve a problem, you really can't assume what the solution is. You need to understand who your users are and how they're different from you. And I think that's one of the big challenges we face with homelessness is there's a lot of stigma. But I thought the quotes that Dr. DeConnick provided to start us off with were really, really poignant because, you know, any of us could be homeless with a bad accident. It's remarkable how close people are. And I think that it's something we all need to appreciate that we're not so different than those that are unsheltered. And with that, I think we can turn it over to questions. I'm also going to have to step out shortly because my son is screaming very loudly. So I apologize for that.
Great. Thank you all. I'm so excited by my co-presenter's material, and I have a million questions and thoughts too, but you know, if you haven't had a chance to put anything on the Google Doc, but you've had something kind of marinating, or if something's coming to mind now that you'd like to add for a question, please feel free. We have a couple of questions in there already that we can speak to. And otherwise, I think we have plenty of things that we can also talk about. You know, I have, yeah, like I said, I can dive in at any time. But there was a question just to start. Maybe we'll just kick off with the first question on the Google Doc, which I think is a little bit more broadly about the question of language. So the specific question is, you know, what is the difference between homelessness, and unsheltered, which I can obviously speak a little bit about based on my presentation. But I think maybe language in and of itself might be a question for our whole panel to think about, right? So for example, what does it mean when we call something affordable housing versus, you know, other things, and how is that received by the general public? So, yeah, I don't know, co-presenters, on the point of language, do we want to maybe start there for just a second and see if anything comes to mind for people?
Just very, very, very quickly, but on the question of language, it's a very important one. There's a whole group of people working on obtainable housing, right? So that if Dr. Zwolinski was telling us about all the subsidies to affordable housing, federally and even state, what happens to that space between affordable housing and people taking advantage of those benefits and the lack of mobility to the general market? So right now we are really struggling in that space between the subsidies and affordable housing population that are already housed and the general market. It keeps getting further and further away. So a lot of people are speaking about obtainable housing, right? Or bringing the market down. So those are really important. And it's important to also understand that changes in legislation start with language.
Yeah, Dr. Zwolinski, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that too. I want to give you space if you want to respond, especially on the housing front, before I talk about the language surrounding homelessness. But if not, it's
no, please go ahead, Kate. I think that's your issue. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. When it comes to, you probably noticed this question probably came from the fact that when I speak in my presentation, I tend to talk about people experiencing homelessness, or I use the term unsheltered. I really try and use human-centered language in all of the work that I do, you know, in religious studies, but also in talking about this issue in particular, because when you hear a phrase like the homeless or you know, something like that, it's kind of like, you know, putting that identity on a group of people who are actually very multifaceted people, right? You know, someone is not defined by the fact that they do not currently have shelter. It's, you know, something they might be going through in their life. So when I use the phrase unsheltered, I'm usually literally talking about someone who does not have shelter, who might be sleeping on the streets. When I talk about housing insecure, I'm talking about someone who might be couch surfing but not have a place of their own, or might be sleeping in their car. But for me, I just try to avoid kind of broad categories of just saying like the homeless. So that's where I was getting at with the language I was using, at least. Yeah. We also Had a question that might also relate to some of the question about affordable housing from multiple perspectives. There was a question about what is better for cities, horizontal or vertical topologies. So maybe Dr. Lopez Perez, you want to start with that? Because I think you introduced that, vocab to us.
Yes, and we are caught in between both, right? I mean, we can only look at San Diego, and you look at downtown and you see a certain density, then you look a little bit away to like places like Fashion Valley, density goes down half. Downtown's 30 stories, Fashion Valley's 15 stories, and then we go down. And we're always caught in this, and I really appreciate Dr. Zwolinski's descriptions of high density versus equity and how high density is perceived by some. And it's incredibly difficult to work that intermediate range, right? That gives us the capacity to break free from these. The systems that create these typologies are so efficient. And to go back to Dr. Hopel's definition, I mean, we are still living in a construction industry that dates back to the 19th century. So how are we able to introduce new technologies, but not be caught in either high dense or really low density? So it's really neither. It's really a balance. And yeah, how do we do it? How do we get to that intermediate scale?
Great. Yeah, Dr. Sullivan, you have your hand up too. Did you want to jump in with a question?
Unless students want to jump in before me.
No, there's nothing else in the chat right now. I mean, I put some questions in, but those are just from me, so I'd rather hear from you.
There are so many great questions to be gleaned from this because, boy, you guys just knocked it out of the park. It's awesome. So first thing, the Morena Avenue area is going to be high density. So at least this is the plan for San Diego City. So I'm wondering, like, what can we do being right there, right above it, to affect this project better? And all of you, I think, speak to this, whether it's space versus time kind of biases, or whether it's what Dr. Hupel pointed out in terms of user-centered approach. That's my first point. My second point would be about well, I have to say it, that local media are on it. So from my bias as a media studies professor, the Union Tribune is actually pretty good on this. And I could speak in terms of language to note there's also the visual language that Steve Green brought to this as part of his cartooning last year and the year before, which was really remarkable. And he gave voice to the voiceless. He went and he talked to, homeless on the streets of San Diego. He made characters of them and he described their situations. Boy, that made it as human as anything. And that to me was really an important point too, in terms of counteracting lobbying and the abuse of public media for the few, maybe as Matt might say, for the very few, as opposed to the collective interest.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was such a great contribution, and we got a little bonus field of communication studies in our conversation too. So I love it. Thank you. Dr. Z, I don't know if you have any thoughts either in response to that or just anything that's been kind of floating around in your mind as you've been hearing, everything tonight so far.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to chew on here. I mean, I think in terms of things that we can do, I mean, I mentioned NIMBYism in my little presentation, but there is also such a thing as YIMBYism, right? Yes, the Yes in My Backyard movement, and this is something that Connor Doherty talks about a good deal in his Golden Gates book. And it's kind of what it sounds like, right? These are activists who try to support politically more housing, more affordable housing, more development that's going to meet people's needs. And it's in some ways not as large as a movement as NIMBYism because it doesn't have the same kind of material interest driving it. These aren't people who are trying to drive up their own property values. These are people trying to do something that they think is in the public interest. But there are local YIMBY organizations in San Diego that you can get involved with if you lean politically in that way. In terms of what kind of development is best for San Diego, whether it's high density or low density, I mean, I don't know that there's any one right answer or universal answer to that question. I think there's a place for both of these kinds of development. One of the problems from a kind of economic perspective right now, in the way we have things set up, is that, yeah, in a sense, we have a choice between high density and low density, but the rules of the game have been rigged in such a way as to dramatically favor one kind of housing over the other. That is to say, dramatically favor low density housing over high density housing. So low density housing has a lot of costs associated with it, right? You have to build roads to get to the suburbs. You have to get utilities out to the suburbs. But a lot of those costs are subsidized by the state. It's not the homeowners who are paying those costs. Those costs are funded by general tax revenues, which again fall dispersed upon all taxpayers. So part of the problem here is that we're sort of artificially promoting one sort of housing. The single family mortgage interest deduction is one of the biggest ways in which we do this from a public policy perspective. And so it's not as though the results that we see when we look out at the world today and see like a certain amount of high density and a certain amount of low density housing, that result is not natural, right? It's not the result of people's free and unfettered choices. It's the result of a system that again has sort of stacked the deck in various, sometimes hard to see, but nevertheless real, very real ways in favor of certain kinds of development and against others.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick on what you're saying, Matt, because you mentioned NIMBY, not in my backyard, and you mentioned YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. And there's actually another movement that's becoming increasingly popular here in San Diego called YIGBY, which is yes in God's backyard, which is like the perfect coming together of our fields in a way. Because what it is religious communities that are saying, how can we use our property, various parking lots or spaces that we're not using to create kind of small scale or in sometimes like 20 units, right, of affordable housing on their property, right? So I'm in conversation with some of the folks who are part of that movement. And it's just this interesting kind of political / religious activism that we're seeing emerging here too. So it's an interesting blending of our fields.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
It's very close to A99, right? So there's a zoning lenience, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to just chime in for one moment on David, on inviting the students to be involved. So your question is right on. In what way does is our campus involved in Linda Vista and in Morena? I wanted to invite all the students to be involved. We are doing so many different initiatives. There's the Linda Vista initiative that works works directly with different communities, local communities that we work a lot with Carson Elementary. And I think that those kind of collaborations through strategic initiatives, through your classwork, even individuals, through clubs, are extraordinary because they create awareness and they create participation, absolutely.
Yeah, and we actually included on the Google Doc with the same question doc that we were just all adding to together. We included a whole bunch of resources for you. So if this is, if these are topics that you don't want to just stop talking about after tonight or stop thinking about, there's incredible event series, there are volunteer opportunities, internship opportunities. There are so many ways you can get plugged into these issues. So we tried to curate a list of at least some of those for all of you, which you can find in the doc as well. But I know we're at time, so presenters, are we good with wrapping up here for tonight? I feel like we're always skimming the surface with our conversations together, but I enjoyed speaking with both of you.
Yes.
Yeah, this is great. There's lots more to talk about, but I guess even if we talked for another hour, that would be true.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone who was able to be here with us tonight. And yeah, we're wishing you all a great weekend, and we'll see you around classes and maybe someday around campus again soon too. Take good care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kate.
Very much. Thanks, everybody.